The smell of horses came first. Not smoke, not blood. Just horses, sweat, leather, and something else. The scent of a long road pressed deep into skin and fur. The wind was blowing from the east. The Mongol army was coming from the east. The army's smell arrived before the army did. You dropped your pickaxe. It stayed in the dirt, just like that. Nobody was going to take it. But you let go, because holding it felt pointless. Because in that single moment, that one moment, the field, the pickaxe, the wheat, all of it stopped meaning anything. You looked toward the horizon. You saw dust. But it wasn't dust. Dust doesn't shake like that. Something was rising from the ground, not from footsteps, from weight, from thousands of horses taking thousands of steps. You could feel something moving through the earth, constant, unbroken. And you already knew the name Genghis Khan. Everyone did. There was no one left who hadn't heard it. But knowing the name and seeing that dust, those were two completely different things, and no word in any language could close that gap. You ran. You didn't know why. There was nowhere to go. The village was behind you. No walls, no gates, just 70-some houses made of mud brick and stone. But stopping wasn't possible either. Your body had made the decision before you did. You just ran. Let's go back 3 days, because everything changed in 3 days. And before it changed, everything was completely normal. Life in a medieval Central Asian village was perfectly normal. And you can't understand those 3 days without first understanding what that normal looked like. The village of Benaket, on the banks of the Syr Darya River, not directly on the Silk Road, just beside it. You used to think about that a lot. If you'd been right on the road, merchants would have stopped, money would have moved. But then again, every passing army would have come through your door too. You always felt a little lucky about where you sat. Now you could see how wrong that calculation had been. Being just beside it hadn't protected you. 72 households in the village. In winter, some families moved away, then came back. Some never came back. Others always stayed. You were one of the ones who stayed. Not by choice exactly. There was land, your father's field, his father's before him. That land had kept you here. Land holds people that way. Not like a rope, like roots. Your house was mud brick, thick walls. Cool in summer, cold but bearable in winter. The roof had been sagging a little more every year. Last spring, you'd thought about fixing it. You put it off. Earlier this month, it crossed your mind again. You put it off again. The roof didn't matter anymore. Your mornings ran in a loop. The animals woke up before you did. When the donkey made noise, you got up. That's how it was. That's how it had always been. You'd get up, wash your face with cold water. In winter, it cut straight to the bone. Even in summer, it was cold. The well was deep. There'd be bread, dry bread, maybe a little yogurt. Then straight to the field. You spent hours out there. In the 13th century, farm work wasn't mechanical. It was effort. It was struggle. It was exhaustion. Constant exhaustion. But you liked that exhaustion, because exhaustion was proof that you'd done something. By the end of the day, your back ached. Your palms were cracked and split, but you'd look at the field and see that something had happened. Visible progress. Most of life didn't offer that. You were in a cycle, but in the field, there was progress. That's what kept you out there. Last month, traders had passed through. A small caravan, 2 camels, coming from Samarkand. Samarkand was a great city. Goods came from there. News came from there. Normally, they would have stopped to rest. This time, they didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. As they passed, one of them said something. His voice was shaking. Otrar had fallen. Otrar. Across the Syr Darya. A city with strong walls. A powerful city. One of the cities that had resisted the Mongol invasion. It had held, but it had fallen. You spent that night sitting up. You wanted to sleep, and your eyes kept closing, but you couldn't. Otrar's fall kept turning in your head. Otrar was a great city. Great cities didn't fall, or they fell, but only after a long fight. Otrar had fought for a long time. You'd always been told that cities like that don't fall, but Otrar had fallen. You got up the next morning, went to the field, worked, came home in the evening, slept, got up the next morning, went to the field. 2 days passed that way. You kept thinking about Otrar, but you kept trying not to think about it too. Both at the same time. A person can know something and not want to know it at the same time. That's not a contradiction. That's just how people protect themselves. Then, on the third day, the sound of hooves arrived. When you came back to the village, everyone was outside. That was strange. It was the middle of the day. The sun was straight overhead. At this hour, everyone should have been in the fields or inside, but they were in the street. All of them. Women, children, old men, looking at each other, not speaking. Because speaking wouldn't have done anything. Old Varzak was the eldest in the village. Whether he was 80 or 90, nobody knew. Not even him. He was sitting on his usual stone, the flat rock in front of his house, hands resting on his knees. He looked calm. His eyes were closed. In the middle of the day. Eyes closed. Varzak did this when he was afraid. You'd seen it as a child. You'd seen it during the famine year. You'd seen it when the river flooded. He'd sat just like that then too. Eyes closed. As if not seeing could somehow shrink the danger. As if time could stop while his eyes were shut. But this time felt different. Because back then, he'd opened his eyes. He'd stood up. He'd moved. During the famine, he'd shared his own bread with others. During the flood, he'd waded in and carried children to the other bank. Even when that man was afraid, he acted. Now, he just sat. That shook you more than anything else. The dust on the horizon was still rising, but it was closer now. The sound of hooves had grown too. Before it had been a steady rhythm, a far-off rhythm, uniform, predictable. Now it was more layered, more horses, more weight. The ground wasn't just trembling anymore. It was groaning. A vibration rose continuously from beneath your feet. What were Mongol riders like? You'd heard things from traders. Everyone had stories. Steppe warriors, they were called. Men born on horseback. They could fire a bow while riding full speed. Their arrows hit their mark even at a gallop. You'd heard all of it. The stories were true. They were just information. And information, in that moment, changed nothing in your body. Your body felt something else entirely. Your body didn't know. Your body only heard, only felt. And what it felt was getting closer. Farnuk, the village headman, gathered the men. You went. About 20 steps away. Close enough to hear his voice. But you wanted to stay back too. A contradictory feeling. You wanted to know, and you didn't want to know at the same time. 17 men had gathered. 17. Including the old, including the young. Farnuk's son was 14. He was there too, standing next to his father. His face was flat. You couldn't tell if he was afraid. Maybe he couldn't tell either. Farnuk spoke. You would surrender. There was no other choice. Farnuk didn't explain it at length. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew. If you barricaded the doors and fought, how long could mud brick walls hold? If you ran, where would you go? In what direction? Toward whom? Across the Syr Darya, toward where Otrar used to be. Fight with 17 men against tens of thousands. Maybe hundreds of thousands? Surrender was the only option. And there was one thing people said about Genghis Khan's army. No mercy for those who resisted. Those who surrendered were sometimes left unharmed. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes. That sometimes was the only thing you had to hold on to right now. You were holding on to a rumor. Your life was built on a rumor. That felt strange. But you didn't have time to think about how strange it was. The hooves were very close now. You weren't just hearing it anymore. You were feeling it. In your chest. In the soles of your feet. Like a pulse. But not your pulse. A pulse coming from outside. How many hundreds of horses? How many thousands? You didn't know. There was no way to count. Farnock stepped forward. You stepped forward. All of you did. You stood at the entrance to the street. Hands open. No weapons. You didn't have any to begin with. But now, you had to show it. You had to say with your body that you were unarmed, that you were submitting, that you had no intention of fighting. The first rider appeared. The horse was small. Mongol horses were small. Steppe horses. Not big, but relentless. They could run for days. Go without food for days. Nothing like the tall horses you'd heard about elsewhere, but they could go places tall horses couldn't. The man on top looked disproportionately large. Leather armor. Bow across his back. He was just looking. Scanning. Counting the houses. Counting the men. Calculating something. His eyes moved over you without stopping. As if he didn't see you. As if he saw the land. Saw the trees. But didn't see you. That feeling, the feeling of being unseen, was a strange thing. It was sharper than fear. Fear you understood. But what was behind this man's eyes, you didn't understand. He counted you. Calculated. Moved on. The ones behind him poured through. Like a river. The army flowed like a river. It couldn't be stopped. It couldn't be steered. It just flowed. You stood on its bank, trying not to get wet, trying not to get pulled in. Horses came. Horses passed. Supply wagons came. Heavy wheels ground into the earth. The sound, unbroken. The smell, unbroken. That burnt smell was still there. Samarkand, Otrar, some other city before that, you didn't know. But the smell was on the army. They carried it with them. They carried the feeling of somewhere no longer existing. So this is what the flow of history looks like, you thought. It was written in books. Great armies marched, it said. Great cities fell, it said. But standing on the side of that great army, history didn't look great. History looked small. You could see the faces of the men passing by. Tired faces. The exhaustion of a long road. Some of them looked at you. Most didn't. It wasn't over in an hour. It wasn't over in 2. You stood there. You couldn't move. Moving would remind them you existed. Existing was dangerous. The safest thing was to stay completely still. Like a stone. Like the ground. There, but invisible. You were still holding the pickaxe. You noticed that. You'd been gripping it since the field. You'd forgotten. You hadn't even thought about putting it down. You needed to hold on to something, and the closest thing was the pickaxe. That's all it was. One rider slowed. As he passed you, he slowed, stopped, looked at you, then at your hand, at the pickaxe, then back at you. He said something. You didn't know the language. You didn't know Mongolian, but you understood the tone. It sounded like a question. It sounded like a threat. In that moment, there was no difference. The words didn't matter. The tone did. You dropped the pickaxe. It hit the dry ground. A dry sound in dry dirt. The rider looked. At the pickaxe. At you. He moved on. You breathed. You didn't know when you'd stopped breathing. But right then, you breathed. One deep breath. Your lungs filled. The air was hot, full of dust. But you took it. You took it because there was no other choice. As the sun began to set, The last horses passed. The dust was still in the air. It wouldn't settle. It had been ground so hard into the earth that it had become part of the sky. It could stay that way for days, maybe weeks. Farnuk turned around. He counted you. 17. All of you were there. Not one of you had moved. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. You had prayed hard enough for the rumor to be true, and it had been. For now, for tonight. What tomorrow would bring, you didn't know. But for tonight, it had been true. The women were waiting in the doorways, and children behind their mothers. The small ones looked out with curiosity. The older ones understood. The older children had flat faces. That flatness came from fear. Fear sometimes screamed. Sometimes it went silent. With the older children, it went silent. Varzak was still on his stone. His eyes were open now. He was looking at something. Not in any particular direction. At the sky. At history. You couldn't tell. The old man was seeing something. Something you couldn't see. Maybe a vision that only years could give you. Maybe just exhaustion. His eyes were tired. So were yours. That night you went to the field. The other pickaxe you'd left there during the day was still in the dirt. You picked it up, looked at the ground. Where the army had passed was plain to see. Tracks had been left behind. Horses' hooves pressed into earth, leaving marks, hundreds of marks, thousands of marks, all going the same direction, west. They were gone, but the tracks remained, and you remained. Your field remained. The soil had been crushed, but it was still there. You started working the ground with the pickaxe. Maybe it didn't make sense. It was dark. You couldn't see clearly. But stopping wasn't possible. Staying still made the fear grow. Moving didn't scatter the fear, but it made it bearable. Bearable fear wasn't the same as paralyzing fear. Bearable fear meant you could keep going. You struck the earth. It made a sound. Dry earth makes a sound like nothing else. You can't hear it anywhere else in the world. In the dark before dawn, alone in the field, on top of the tracks left by the Mongol army, the sound of a pickaxe hitting the ground. You struck. You kept going. Because you didn't know what else to do. Because the land was still yours. That same year, the Mongol Empire took Samarkand, took Bukhara. Great cities fell. Great names entered history. Battles filled books. The names of conquerors were carved into stone. But the name Benekit didn't make it into history. Because Benekit hadn't resisted. Benekit had waited, and they had passed over it. The place's history records are the ones that fought. The ones that waited became numbers. Village, 72 households, passed through. But you were there. You were there when your pickaxe touched the earth. You were there when the army passed. You were there when Varzak's eyes closed. You were there when the children went silent. Genghis Khan kept marching west. His army never paused. There were hundreds, thousands of villages like Benekit in his path. Some had resisted. Some had been wiped out. Some had only waited. And the Mongols had kept going. Medieval history tells us about great men, great battles. It tells us about empires rising and falling in the 13th century world. Those stories are true, but they're incomplete. Because beneath every great event, there were small people. There was the man in the field, the man who dropped his pickaxe and picked it back up, the man who spent the whole night holding on to a rumor. There was the woman who covered her child's mouth. There was the old man who closed his eyes. These people didn't enter history, but they lived inside it. And that difference is everything. That's what historical POV storytelling shows us, not the great decisions. In the small moments living in the shadow of great decisions. The fear inside those moments. The choices made out of that fear. The lives that came out of those choices. It shows you your life. Because you're standing somewhere too. Something is passing over you. And you're deciding whether to keep going. The man kept going. His pickaxe touched the earth. Morning came. The sun rose. The dust was still in the air. The man worked his field. Living history always takes you somewhere deeper. In the next video, there's another moment, another place, another person. But the same question: what was it like to be there, in that moment? If you want to be there, don't go anywhere.